Good morning, afternoon or evening everybody. Welcome back to part 4 of this 1/35th scale Panther 44 series. Last time out we tackled the ambush camouflage scheme and the decals. You can catch up with any previous episodes using the link above. This video will focus on the chipping of the tank, starting to add character and depth to this late war Panther. So, without further ado, let's chip this thing. For the chips, I will be using these colors from Vallejo, German yellow for the initial layer, then a mixture of German grey and purple for the deeper steel chip layer. I find these work perfectly for this scheme. Before we can add the chips, we need to prepare a sponge. I am using an artist's sponge from the range. These are cheap and perfect for the job at hand. First, I cut the sponge into a small rectangle. The smaller the section, the more control we will have with the chips, but too small and the process will take 1,000 years. Once we have a small section cut, I use a pair of push tweezers to clamp the sponge and act as a handle. Then I get another pair of tweezers and start roughing up the end of the sponge. This is crucial to give variation in the chip sizes. With the tool made, we can now start chipping. I make a yellow solution mixed with water, then soak the sponge and decant most of the paint onto a piece of kitchen roll. We can then start chipping the tank, focusing on edges of panels and high wear areas. You want to ensure that there is not too much paint on the sponge, as this will completely wreck the area you are painting. It's always good practice to try this out first on an area you can't see, or if in doubt, decant more onto the tissue paper. You can always add more chips by repeating the process, but getting rid of them is a lot of hard work. I use the German yellow for all the areas of the tank, as the entire thing would have been painted in this color prior to the camouflage scheme being added, therefore worn areas would appear this color. You could go whole hog and mix up 3 different initial chip colors, but I was pretty happy with how just using the German yellow turned out. I keep going, adding small amounts of chips at a time, repeating the process of reloading the sponge and decanting paint into the tissue, then carefully adding the chips. Once I'm happy with the level of chipping, I join up the chips on the edges with a fine paintbrush. I also paint some of the raised areas that the paint would naturally wear off, like rivets and around the lamp casing. It's also a good opportunity to add scratches. Just ensure you decant most of the paint from the brush and use very light strokes. This process does take time, but is worth it in the end, in my opinion. Next, it's time to mix a steel color for the deeper chips. I find a combination of German grey and purple is perfect for this task. No exact science to this, but about 3:1 ratio grey to purple with a dash of water is about right. It's purely fine brushwork with the dark grey, filling in some of the larger chips we made with the yellow. The aim here is to highlight areas that would have been worn down all the way to the steel. Again, focusing on the edges of the panels, raised areas, and any large yellow chips. Again, this does take a fair amount of time, but the results will speak for themselves. Whack on a good podcast. Ways of making you talk is my go-to. Or a good audiobook and relax into the process. At this point, I do need to give a shout out to Uncle Night Shift, who I think is the master of this technique. Do check him out if you haven't done already. My variant of this process is slightly less precise, a Temu version if you like. This whole process is repeated over the front glacier plate. I try and focus on one area at a time to keep a bit of variation in the process. Otherwise, I find I start getting bored and rushing. It can also be a tad overwhelming to chip the entire tank in one hit. For the top deck and flatter areas of the tank, it's a pretty similar process. Mix up the paint, soak the paint, and decant onto some kitchen roll. This time though, as there is no real edges for the sponge to catch onto, I give a very light coat of chips with the sponge around the edges of the hatches and some small ones on the plate itself. I am very light with the pressure for these areas, as otherwise we will get some rather large splodges of yellow all over the place. Most of the work on these flat areas is done by brush, going around the edges of the hatches and trying to paint on the small chips by hand. This method of painting the chips is the hardest and longest part of the process. Luckily, there isn't many of these areas on a tank, mainly on the front deck area. Again, for the steel layer, we mix up our German grey and purple mixture, diluted with some tap water. The steel layer is exactly the same as was done on the front, again filling in the large chipped areas and painting the edges of hatches, tops of handles and anywhere you want worn down to metal. These areas do require a little bit more precision than the edges of raised features and require somewhat a steady hand. My hands are not the steadiest by any means, but to help I often squeeze a stress ball or something soft for 10 seconds before and practice deep breathing exercises. I find the more relaxed you are in this process, the easier it is to paint. To add a bit of shine to the steel, I use a graphite stick. Those eagle-eyed among you will have seen this was already done on the glacier plate when I showed you the finished area. In my opinion, this is the easiest and cheapest way to add a bit of realism to armor projects. I simply go over all the grey elements with the graphite and blend with a sponge or a cotton bud. Any mistakes, or if you add too much, can easily be removed using a box standard eraser. Well, that's the process in a nutshell, a fairly simple one, and can be very effective. I work my way around the entire hull, chipping section by section. The key is having a plan regarding how much you want to chip the vehicle. I wanted this Panther to look pretty beaten up, being a late war variant when the tides are very much against Germany by this point. Once you have chipped one panel, that level of chipping needs to be repeated across the entire thing. So if you don't want a tank that's very beaten up, start small, then add more later if you want to. This was probably my longest chipping session to date, and took a long time, but I was pretty happy with how it came out. So that's the main thing. Once the hull was done, I moved on to the turret. This was one of the easiest and fastest sections of the tank. Because of the amount of panel lines and features, this enabled the sponge to do most of the hard graft. Even the hand painting is a lot faster on these sections, because you can simply run the brush against the edge of the metal and join up any gaps. The wheels and sprockets, however, are a different matter. I spent a lot of time on these as they would get pretty scratched up in the field. I focus especially on all the areas that would make contact with the tracks and guide horns, and add plenty of graphite to give a fresh worn shine. The last stage is to lock in all our hard work with a coat of varnish. As always, I use this Satin varnish by VMS, my go-to for clear coat work. This will protect these areas from the enamel and oil weathering in the next stage. And that is it. Chipping complete. It's quite a haul of a process, this one, so thank you for staying with me. Next time, we will start to paint the details and start the weathering process. If you have found this video helpful or vaguely entertaining, please hit those like and subscribe buttons and let me know your thoughts in the comments. But for now, farewell and happy modeling, everybody.